Greetings, students, and welcome back to the virtual classroom, the virtual camp of Company K, 67th New York Infantry, 1st Long Island Volunteers. And if you don't already know, my name is Max Kenny, also known as Lieutenant William Kent. In this video, we're going to be talking about what did they eat? What was a soldier's diet like? Well, a Frenchman, a very famous one, by the name of Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of France, stated something that was historically accurate in any age, and that an army marches on its stomach. Now, what did Napoleon mean like that? He didn't mean by getting on the ground and wriggling around on your stomach doing the worm. What he meant is that before the soldiers could fight, they need to be fed. When talking about a soldier's diet, we often use two terms, which we'll define for you. The first is rations.
A soldier's ration refers to a specific allowance of food provided by the government that are made for quick distribution and preparation for eating in the field. This food must survive long storage times, adverse conditions such as heat, humidity, or the cold, and be securely packaged.
The second is the commissary.
The commissary is the military department responsible for supplying the soldiers with food. Working for the commissary was a tremendous challenge, and they had to keep the men fed constantly, usually over great distances and harsh conditions.
Now, what was a typical soldier's ration? Well, that depends on if they were in a fixed camp or if they were on the march.
The soldier's ration while in camp consisted of 12 ounces of pork or bacon, or 1 pound, 4 ounces of salt or fresh beef, 1 pound, 6 ounces of soft bread, or flour, or 1 pound of hard bread, or 1 pound 4 ounces of cornmeal. Also, if you were in a camp, for every 100 rations, that would be a full company, since a company is 100 men, there would also be distributed 1 peck of beans or peas, 10 pounds of rice or hominy, 10 pounds of green coffee, or 8 pounds of roasted, and or 1 pound, 8 ounces of tea, 15 pounds of sugar, 2 quarts of salt, 4 quarts of vinegar, 4 ounces of pepper, a half bushel of potatoes, and a quart of molasses. The soldiers' rations while on the march consisted of 3/4 pounds of salt pork, or 1 pound of fresh meat, and 1 pound of hard bread, and for every 100 soldiers, they would receive sugar, coffee, and salt.
Well, you should know by now how important it is to have a well-balanced diet. Certainly at some point, your teachers have taught you about the 4 food groups. And what we're going to do is go through each of them and see where it satisfied or did not satisfy the soldier's nutritional needs. Okay, we'll start off with the first, and that is protein. And when we mean protein, we usually mean meat. The soldiers were given meat, most often pork, but also beef, but not prepared quite like you would expect.
Back then it was called salt pork or salt beef because the meat was literally pounded and stored with tons of salt. And why was that? Because there was no refrigeration. Meat spoils. How do you keep it from spoiling? By using the world's oldest preservative, salt. Meat was packed and transported in huge barrels of salt and brine to keep from spoiling. By the time the meat reached the men, it was more salt than actual meat. So they had to boil the meat just to remove the salt. And a lot of times it wasn't quality meat. It could often be fatty, stringy, and despite the salt, could get spoiled or rancid. Fresh meat was rare, although you could get it in a fixed camp. And sometimes you would have herds of cattle following along the soldiers to be slaughtered.
Another great source of protein was beans. The men ate lots and lots of beans. Beans were easy to transport and they had a long shelf life. All they had to do was simply boil them to make them edible. The second of the food groups would be carbohydrates. And when we mean carbs, we typically mean bread. And what was the form of bread back in the Civil War? Well, this is hardtack. Now hardtack, fitting its name, is very hard. And what it is it's an unleavened piece of bread. It's baked in layers to make it really tough. The little holes that you see here are used to have the bread bake evenly. And the reason why they're baked so hard is that they had to be transported, usually on wagons with no shocks over very bumpy roads. So in order for these to arrive in one piece, they had to be tough. And they'd be stored in wooden crates. And by the time they would reach the soldiers, these were so hard that they simply just couldn't eat it. They were often called sheet iron crackers or teeth dullers. So in order to make these edible, what they would do is they would take the hardtack, put it in probably one of their tin cups, and then they'd find some blunt object to smash it, like this. And then they would take the remnants, and then they would simply put it in their coffee. And it would soften it up and make them edible, and also took care of another problem. Now you see these little holes in here? Well, sanitary standards weren't quite what we have now. And food would often lie in warehouses for months. And what usually attracts food just lying around is, well, little hitchhikers. So by the time that the hardtack reached the men, this would be kind of wriggling. And what I mean by wriggling, I'm meaning bugs. The men would put this in the coffee, and all of the little hitchhikers would float to the top. Well, they could either just skim off all of the insects or just simply eat them. What we know now is that insects are actually a pretty good source of protein. There were times where the men would actually have bread that you would recognize today, but that would only be if they were in a fixed location for a while, such as winter camp, and they would set up temporary bakeries where they could bake fresh bread. Another excellent source of carbohydrates are potatoes and rice. The men were issued those because both potatoes and rice, again, are easy to transport and they have a long shelf life. Okay, now we're going to get into the third of the food groups, dairy products. Trying to get fresh milk or fresh eggs was pretty rare. In fact, most men would acquire these items usually from a farmer, either with or without permission. Or, to get fresh dairy, the men would turn to sutlers. Now, sutlers were 19th century businessmen, private businessmen, that would simply follow the armies and sell them all sorts of items, whether it be food, clothing, writing paper, even whiskey. And, well, they charged a pretty penny for their services. You could get, well, a pound of butter for $1. You could get cheese for about 50 cents a pound, or get yourself a can of condensed milk for 75 cents. You see, by the middle of the 19th century, the industry of canning had begun, and so you could start to can foods. However, these prices might seem cheap to you, but back then, a private, the lowest man in the ranks, received about $13 a month. So it was a bit pricey. You better have really wanted those fresh eggs and cheese. Now we really come to the food group which is most sorely lacking in a soldier's diet. Fruits and vegetables. Back in the 19th century, they knew enough that they had to have a properly balanced diet in order to stave off diseases such as scurvy or rickets. However, again, with no refrigeration, it was impossible to deliver fresh fruits and vegetables. And the men had to resort on, well, either going to the sutlers or, again, just getting it off the land, and that usually meant taking it off of farms. There were some types of vegetables which were issued that did seem to work out, and vegetables such as onions or split peas. Again, they were easy to carry and they did tend to last a long time. Sometimes the soldiers would get their hands on dried fruits, such as apples or peaches.
And the military experimented with a primitive form of freeze-drying called desiccated vegetables. To desiccate something means to remove all the moisture. So the army would take all sorts of veggies like carrots, turnips, parsnips, leafy greens, and then squeeze them under great pressure to shrink and remove all the water. Then cut them into 2 or 3 inch squares and distribute. When the soldiers received these blocks, they would dump them in water and presto, instant salad. More often than not, it was a mess, and unscrupulous suppliers often threw in grass and leaves, so they were eating like cows, and that would do a number on their stomachs.
All right, now up to this point, we've talked about food. What about drinks? And namely, what about water? Well, we'll get to the water in a bit, but first of all, what makes the men march? Coffee. Lots and lots of coffee. The Army made sure to issue a lot of coffee beans to the men, but the coffee beans didn't come as you know them now. You see, now they usually come roasted, but in their raw form, coffee beans are green. What you would have to do is you would have to roast them, and so that's where you would turn to your trusty frying pan, dump the raw beans, and then just roast them open fire. Now once the beans were roasted, you needed to crush them or grind them. And this, again, your bayonet was a handy coffee grinder. Put the coffee beans in a tin cup, smash them up, and then you would pour them into boiling water. Now as far as filters are concerned, if you're fortunate enough, you might get yourself a piece of cheesecloth in order to strain it, or what did the men rely on? Socks. Now if you didn't like coffee, you could get tea. This is a block of tea. What you're actually looking at, it looks like a piece of chocolate. These are tea leaves, and they're super compressed, and it's hard, and it would come in these big sheets and broken off into blocks. Tea originated usually from the Far East, either India or China. In fact, you can actually see the Chinese writing that's embossed on it. And all you would need to do is, when you get yourself a block of one of these, is you would just take your knife and start shaving some of these leaves into boiling water, and presto, you have yourself a pretty strong cup of tea. Now, what is the key ingredient for both coffee and tea? Well, that would be water, the stuff of life. Water was the soldier's greatest necessity, but it was also his greatest threat. And why is that? Where did they get their water from? Well, they certainly didn't get bottled water from the Army. They would simply take their canteen and fill it up wherever they can. That meant rivers, streams, ponds, lakes, and if they were fortunate, they could actually get themselves a farmer's well, which was probably one of the safest areas to draw their water from. Now students, would you drink from any of these? Now why is that? Well, that's because all of these sources of water usually contain something that the soldiers just couldn't see. And we're talking about germs.
In the 1860s, humans were aware of the existence of germs, but they didn't yet know that germs cause disease. We'll talk further in the medical video, but unclean water was the norm, and that caused a lot of disease. The most common was dysentery, a chronic form of diarrhea, and since there weren't many cures, men would die from dehydration.
Drinking coffee or tea was probably the healthiest thing that the soldiers were doing, and they didn't even realize it. That's because what do when you make coffee or tea? You boil the water. And what happens when you boil the water? You sterilize it, meaning that it's all free from microbes and safe to drink. As for the delivery of all of these rations, well, even though the government promised them to the men, there's a big difference between what the government promises and what it delivers, just like today. And sometimes the men were stuck for stretches of time without any rations at all, so they had to improvise. Now they could complement their diet by going to a sutler and paying for it, or usually, and this is what was most often happening, was that they would go out foraging. Now what does foraging mean? It means to go out and gather or collect, sometimes with, sometimes without the permission of whoever owns whatever you're foraging. Now once the soldiers had gotten their food, they had to prepare it. Now if they were in a fixed camp, usually the companies, which was about 100 men, they would have themselves their own commissary tent, where you would have people specifically tasked with cooking. Or, if you were on the march, you would form what's called a mess. And when I mean a mess, I'm not talking about what your parents are always telling you to clean up after. A mess, in military terminology, is either a place where you eat, such as a mess hall, or a mess is a group of soldiers that form a sort of a club for cooking. And what they do is they share responsibilities, and they also share all of the cooking implements to lighten the load. And I have some examples here. You know, you've already seen my frying pan, which is made out of a canteen half. You have tinware. and tin was very light. Knives, forks, tin plate. And also you have some heavier items. This is wrought iron. This is a small pan. And I even have a bigger one right here. And of course, there's always the ever-present tin cup, or as we call them, a dipper. Now, all of this tinware that you see was soldered at the time with lead, which, well, today we know is poisonous. So, needless to say, in 21st century Civil War reenactors do not use lead solder in our tinware. Okay, now we've come to the part where we'll be taking your questions and answering the best we can. We hope that you've learned something from our video on What Did They Eat? A Soldier's Diet.